Today I'm going to go over interactions within Unity's new input system. I'm going to be going over what they are, how to use them, and also implementing your own custom one if you'd like. So I already have this project set up. For this you'll need the input system installed, so go to Window Package Manager, then go to Unity Registry up here, and scroll down until you see Input System. And then you can install the input system down here on the right. There will be an install button. Currently I'm using the preview version. If you'd like, you can go to the Settings, Advanced Project Settings, Enable Preview Packages. So just select that and you can exit out, and then you can click this drop down button, see other versions, and you'll see all the preview versions. The preview one is not required. However, I'll be showing a specific function that's only available on the preview.2 package, but you might not even need to use that. So if you're not familiar with the input system, you can right click and create a new input action, and you can name it player controls as an example. And I have a bunch of videos on this if you'd like to check it out, but you want to add in an action map. Let's just call it map, and then an action. So I'm just going to call this a tap action. A map is a set of controls, and our actions are the actual controls. And a control can have multiple bindings. So you can see on the right here we have an action type. We can choose between 3 types. And I have a whole video going into depth on what each of these does and what they mean. For now I'm going to select button since it's easier to explain. And so this is the important part, the interactions. So if you click this plus button, you'll see we have 5 different default interactions that we can add: hold, multi-tap, press, slow tap, and tap. For example, if we add in the press interaction, you'll see that a couple things pop up here. We have a trigger behavior, which is press only, and a press point. So to better explain what all this means, first I have to explain what exactly an interaction is and why changing this trigger behavior and press point are important for the interaction and the action. So what exactly is an interaction? Well, it's a specific input pattern. But what is an input pattern? Well, a pattern is just a sequence of events. And there's 5 different patterns that they provide us: press, tap, hold, multi-tap, and slow tap. In the case of this image, you'll see we're tapping on this subscribe button, which you should totally do. But that's a pattern because we're tapping once. That's one pattern. If we hold it down, we have to wait a certain amount of time while we're holding down for it to register. Once it's registered, then we do something. That's another type of pattern. Along with multi-tap, if you tap multiple times, that's another pattern. And so what can we do with these patterns? Well, the interactions are patterns. And so if we apply an interaction, then our action will have to be performed in that certain way, or else it won't register. So to better understand that, if you're not familiar with the input system, it's based on events. So it has a couple of events here. It's started, performed, and canceled. So started is when you have started the action. So for example, if it's a button, we started pressing it down. Performed is when the interaction is complete. If it's a button, that's also when you press it down. And canceled is when an interaction is interrupted or aborted. So in this case, if we're pressing down a button, that means we're lifting our finger. And so you can see here it has more detailed explanations. And so you're probably familiar with this. If you've already used the new input system, you subscribe to the performed callback to know when an action has taken place, and then you do something with those values. So it also depends on the type of the action. So for example, if you have a value versus a button versus a pass-through, these callbacks may be called at different occasions. And so I do have a whole video on this, so if you're interested, check it out. It's in the description, but you can see here that they're called on different occasions. Specifically, let's focus on the button. So the started one is when it's been pressed, but it has not necessarily passed the press threshold yet. So that's the press point that we saw previously with the press interaction. 0.5 is how much the button needs to be pressed in order to be performed. Button has passed the press threshold. But for a keyboard button, you can't really tell the difference in values. You're either pressing it or not pressing it. This would better be suited for a trigger on a gamepad, where you can easily measure the change in value between 0 and 1, which is what the input system returns. 0 if it's not registered, or 1 if it's registered. Or in this case, it's called actuated. So the interactions will determine when these callbacks are called on the action. So back to the editor, let's go over this press interaction. So normally for a button, it'll be performed once we press it down. But we can add a press interaction, and if we want it to be performed only when we release the button, then we can select the release only trigger behavior. And so now it will be performed once we lift our finger from the button. There's also press and release, so it'll perform this action when you press and release it. And the press point is 0.5, which is in the middle of 0 and 1. You can change this by unselecting default and putting your own value in. You can also change the defaults in the input setting here. You can create a new settings asset and then change the default values. You can see they have default tap time, hold time, tap radius, etc. So I already have an input action asset created here. with more examples. So let's see the hold one. So for the hold, you see we have a press point just as the press interaction. And so this more applies for triggers on gamepads and that sort. We also have a hold time, so this is important. So this is how long you have to hold down the button for it to register as performed. If you lift your finger up before these 0.4 seconds have passed, then this action will be interrupted, aka cancelled, and that is the event callback that you'll get. Then we have tap, where it's a quick tap on the screen, and so you have a maximum tap duration, which is the maximum time that your finger can be pressing down on it before it cancels this tap event. So it's not a tap, it's more like a press. And quick tip, you can hover over these if you're still in doubt and you can see what they mean. And press point as well. Then we have slow tap, which is you tap slowly. And this is when you press down, you have to press down for a minimum of 0.5 seconds in order for it to register as a slow tap. Now the difference between a slow tap and a hold is that the slow tap will only perform the event once you lift your finger, thus the tap. With the hold, it'll perform the event even if you're still holding down the button. And then finally we have MultiTap, which is just tapping a bunch of times. So in this case we have a tap count of 2, so we have to tap 2 times on the screen or pressing our button. The max tap spacing is how long maximum time between each tap, because you don't want the time between each of the taps to be too long because then it won't really register as a multi-tap. And then the max tap duration is how long you're allowed to have your finger on the button before it does not register as a multi-tap. So this is similar to the tap in that regards, and all we're doing is applying a spacing so that we can have multiple taps at once. And as well, we have a press point here. So I have a scene here with the 5 interactions. So if I quickly tap, you'll see that the tap is registered as performed, green is performed, red is cancelled, and yellow is started, which we don't have any yellow right now. So when I hold it down, you'll see that press is performed, hold is performed, tap is not performed, slow tap is started, so it's waiting for me to release it for it to be performed, and then we have multi-tap, which is red because I'm holding it down for too long. So if I let it go, you'll see that now slow tap is green because I held it down and I released it. Alright, so let's see what happens when I tap 2 times quickly. So pay attention to this one here, multi-tap. So the multi-tap was yellow, but then it turned green. So on the first tap, it was started, but it only turned green on the second tap. And then tap also turned green because I tapped quickly enough. So I hope this provided a little bit of clarification onto what each of these does, and the link to the source code is in my Patreon in the description below. But if you are interested, all I did in the code is just take a reference to our input action. I enabled it on the onEnable and on disable code. And then here on the started function, I just subscribed to the started, performed, and cancelled. And I just set the referenced box render material to the color, which is right here. Started is yellow, performed green, cancelled red. And so maybe this graph may help you a little bit. I find it a little bit confusing, but basically you see here we have the different interactions. So for the default interaction, if we press it less than the actuation point or the press point, which is 0.5, so currently it's 0.2, then it will be started and performed. This is the default when we don't have any interaction. When we press it over the 0.5, then it's performed as well. And when we release it, it's also performed. And if the actuation is over 0, when we release it, it'll be performed as well. But when the value reaches 0, it'll be cancelled. With the button, it'll be started and only performed when we pass the actuation point, and it'll be cancelled if we release it. If we do press, on press only, it'll be performed when we press, and same as the button action. On release only, it'll be performed and cancelled once we release. It does not matter the actuation point. With the tap, it'll be started once it goes past the actuation point and we have lifted our finger before this tap time is done. And the slow tap will be started if we press down above the actuation point, and it'll be performed once release. The multi-tap isn't really descriptive here, and the hold will be started once we pass that threshold and once we pass the hold time, and it'll be cancelled once we release it. Alright, so there's something I have not mentioned, and it's the fact that you can put interactions on both the binding and the action itself, which I will show you in a moment. But basically the way it works is that the input system will process the ones from the binding first and then the action. So why does it do it? So let's go back. So you'll see we have an interaction on the action itself, which is like the parent of the bindings. And so if we click on this space keyboard here and we add another interaction, and let's add a hold interaction, it will process this one first before processing the press. And so why would you want to do this? Why can't you just put this on the action itself? Well, let's say you have multiple different control schemes. So if we add a binding here, maybe we select gamepad and maybe we want a trigger. But for the trigger, we want a different interaction than for the spacebar. So let's say we want a hold interaction, and for the spacebar, we want more of a tap. And so it'll process the interactions first on the binding, and then it'll process the interaction on the action. And so you're probably like, wait, won't we just have interactions processing events all over the place? And what if we have multiple bindings on the same action? Well, with the input system, at any one time, only one interaction can be driving the action. Meaning only one interaction at one time can determine the phase that the action is in. So if the bindings come first, let's say we're on the left trigger, we do the hold, and if the hold is cancelled for some reason, then the interactions on the lower stack, which in this case is the press interaction, can take over. And this also applies to multiple interactions on the same binding or action. So if we add another one, let's say we have a press, then the hold will have higher priority over the press interaction. And so once we press down on the button, it'll start the hold interaction, but it will not start the press interaction. This will be the driving interaction. However, if we fail to perform it or if it's canceled, then the press one will take over. And if the press one is interrupted or canceled, then we go up to the interaction on the action itself. So it's kind of like a stack. I hope that makes some sense. Now you're probably wondering, okay, let's say I subscribe to this in code. What if I have both of these interactions and I want to know which one is the current one? Well, luckily I have a script for that. So in this script, I have two references to two different mesh renderers, and this certain action will have a slow tap and a hold. And I'm taking a reference to the action, similar to the other one. So once you enable and disable the action, here in the start, we can perform a check here. If this action .interactions contains slow tap and hold, here I'm saying if it contains it but negated, so if it doesn't contain the slow tap and the hold, then we return. We don't even want to execute this script. So the interactions is an array of strings that you can access that contains all the interactions on your action. And you can access the interactions through these strings. So here I'm subscribing to the started, performed, and canceled events. So let's take a look at the started one. Once it has started, then we check, is the context.interaction a SlowTap interaction? And for this, you need to import the Unity engine.inputSystem.interactions and as well the Unity engine.inputSystem to be able to get this input action reference. So we can differentiate between what kind of interaction it is, and you can use a switch statement as well. And depending on the interaction, you can set the material or do whatever you want. And just to show you what I mean, I've attached this script to a slow tap and hold game object and assigned the correct references. And I've made an action called multiple interactions, slow tap and hold. And so I'm going to show you the difference on priorities. So this is the slow tap being first and the hold being second. Watch what happens. So here, if I press E in this case, I hold it down, the slow tap has started. However, see that the hold is not even registering because the slow tap has precedence. Now if I let it go, it's green. But if I type it quickly, you'll see that the slow tap is false, so it's canceled, and then the hold takes over, but I didn't hold it for long enough, so it's also been canceled. Now watch what happens when I switch the order around. Up here, I just click this move interaction up button. So now the hold is first, save. So watch now when I press E and I hold it down, the hold has been performed, but the slow tap has not. When I lift it up, the hold is red. Now, if I press it quickly, you see that both of them are now red or canceled. So I hope that cleared it up a bit. Two more quick things I want to mention is that I just have a quick example here so you can see you can add an interaction through script if you'd like. So if you want to make a new action, you could just say new input action. Then you can add the binding. This is the controller, which is gamepad, and then left stick. So this is a vector too. And you can add with interactions, and this is the string format that you have to use. Tap interaction with a duration of 0.8. If you'd like to change a binding, you can do action.changeBinding and the index of the binding. So this is the first binding available, the one at the top, with the path of right stick. So we're overriding the left stick with the right stick one. And now we're adding an interaction of a hold with a 3-second duration. If you'd like to remove binding overrides, you can call the remove all binding overrides. which will reset them to default as you have it in your input action asset, or you can remove a specific binding override with the index. Additionally, another way you can use it is doing new input action, the name, the binding, and then the interactions. This is just another way to call it. And another quick useful thing I want to mention is that you can get the current timeout of the interaction. So for example, if you have a hold interaction and you start to press it down, then it'll start this kind of timeout at 0, and then it'll go all the way up to 1, and you can use this maybe for a progress bar if you'd like, or some cool effects. And once it reaches 1, that means the hold interaction is finished. And I added some comments here, which is basically from this Unity documentation that'll link down in the description and has a lot of details. Alright, so I hope you found that useful. Now I'm going to quickly go over custom interactions if you'd like to make your own. So I'm not going to go over writing it, I'm just going to go over how you do it, give you an overview, and hopefully that will help you out. So first you need to make a class, a normal script, but instead of mono behavior, you have to extend from this IInputInteraction interface, which you need to be using the Unity Engine.input system namespace for this. So in this case, I've just taken this straight from the documentation, and I've called this extreme interaction, and it will only be performed once you have extremely changed a value. So for example, in a joystick, if you go from one corner to the other quickly, then it will register the extreme interaction. So this is actually added to the input action asset, which is really cool. So to make sure this interaction shows up in your input action asset, you can add this if we're in the Unity editor directive, then initialize on load. And to use this initialize on load, we need to include this using Unity editor namespace. Alright, so we can have this duration here, and let's say this is the maximum duration we want our action to take. So what's interesting is that this is a static constructor, and we're using a static constructor because we need to initialize a static value, in this case our class. So we can call input system register interaction and then put the name of our class, in this case extreme interaction. And so this is called when the editor loads up. Then you can also have this function if you'd like. I haven't put anything in it, but this is called when the actual game loads, when you press play, and it'll also execute the static constructor as a side effect. So you can put any processing that you'd like to do here. And this runs when the game loads because of this, runtime initialize on load. So this is one of the functions from the interface that we can use. And this is called whenever the binding has a change in value. We can process that value here. So if the timer has expired, which we're going to set soon, which is the duration up here, then we can cancel the action and return from this function. Else we can do a switch statement depending on our current phase. So if we're currently waiting, but we receive an input of 1, then we can start the interaction and we can set our timeout. And if we've started and our action is totally opposite, so if we went all the way from 1 to -1, then we can perform the action and break. So that's pretty cool. Two things I want to mention is that you can also set the total timeout completion time, context.set total timeout completion time. And so if you remember here, I mentioned get timeout completion. If you'd like, you can set that manually in the process function of your interaction, because usually this is determined based on the timeout. So if we set our timeout to be duration, which is 0.2, then that'll be the total completion time. However, for example, if you have a multi-tap interaction and you have to run multiple taps at the same time, this won't really work because the timeout will only be 0.2. But if we want the user to tap 3 times with a duration of 0.2, then we can do 3 times 0.2, or in our case, 3 times duration to set the total timeout completion, which basically means that's how long the action will take to be performed. And as you previously saw above, you can set the timeout of the context manually. And finally, there's this reset function, which sometimes the input system calls reset, and you can do some processing here if you'd like. And I'll link the documentation for the interactions below. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a little bit more about interactions. As always, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And I'd also like to thank my patrons. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. It really helps make these videos possible and also helps me with my rent. And with that, I'd like to thank my new patrons. In the supporter tier we have, thank you so much for your support. In the enthusiastic tier we have Paul, Emilia, Corrado, Disgraced, Mass Hysteria, Sammy, Atahang, James, Alex Gear, Arvin, and Dr. Didact. Thank you so much. And in the dedicated tier we have Hengst. Thank you so much for all of your support. I really appreciate it. Thank you. If you're interested, the link is in the description. It helps me out a lot. And I recently made some changes, so apart from the supporter, enthusiastic, dedicated tiers. As usual, I added annual pay, and I added some other tiers. Benefits include early access to video, source code, and an exclusive Discord channel, along with sneak peeks, calls, sponsors, and merch. And if you haven't already joined, be sure to join our Discord channel where you can chat, post memes, or ask questions. So thank you so much once again. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, and see you next time.